So I stopped making videos for about 6 to 10 months. Not just stopped making videos, but I also stopped consuming most craft content. And honestly, the reason was pretty simple. I felt uninspired. A lot of craft content began to feel a bit repetitive and a little clicky. Very aesthetic, but very consumer fueled. And for the amount of yarn and knitwear I already owned, participation just didn't feel sustainable to me. And I realized I didn't feel excited by any of it. So I stepped away and I gave myself a bit of distance from crafting internet. When I started this series, I thought I was making videos about knitting, but somewhere along the way that stopped being true. Because the more I looked at craft, the less it felt like a hobby, and the more it started to look like a whole system. One of the first things that really stood out to me was how thoroughly labour disappears from the way we talk about craft. Historically, textile was labour. It was slow, skilled, economically necessary. But over time, that work was reframed, not as labour, but as leisure. And as a black woman uploading videos about my craft, that connection and tension has never really been invisible to me. I've always been aware that craft spaces are not neutral, apolitical spaces. They are shaped by social structures, cultural narratives, and economic systems. But I realized that I had never really taken the time to explore those dynamics properly. So that's what this series became, an attempt to step back and ask some bigger questions. Because once something is no longer recognized as labor, it becomes much easier to undervalue it. One of the most striking ideas that emerged from my research is the way labour in craft has gradually been made invisible. Historians of textiles often point out that for most of human history, making cloth and clothing was one of the most labour-intensive forms of work in everyday life. Spinning, weaving, and knitting took enormous amounts of time and skill. In fact, textile production was so economically important that in many societies it formed the backbone of household economies. So one of the very reasons that feudalism in Britain collapsed was because the landed gentry realised that they could evict the serfs who toiled their land en masse to make way for sheep farming, whose wool would provide a more lucrative income. So as industrialization moved textile production into factories, domestic craft was increasingly reframed not as labor, but as leisure. And sociologists and historians have written countlessly about how activities associated with women, in particular, were often redefined in this way. So work that was economically essential could be described as natural, domestic, or recreational, as a way to minimize those kinds of inputs while glorifying aspects of life relating to profit and economic growth. Although you can't have a society with one without the other. And plus, it still produces material goods, but reframing it as domestic or as an elective hobby devalues the whole industry, keeping practitioners, as we know, or underpaid. Sure, with the invention of industrial knitting machines, hand knitting is no longer essential, but a hand-knitted garment is still desirable all the same. Yet, because of this economic framing of knitting as women's work, a natural act of care like child rearing, a whole industry becomes undervalued and underpaid. So why are knitting patterns so cheap and pattern testers are expected to give their labour for free? Genuine question. Because if the answer is because knitters volunteer their time and resources solely for the benefit of the designer, to test because they genuinely enjoy it, I feel like it's possible to enjoy work and to be compensated. But I think the answer is much more structurally based. As I've said before, once labour is reframed as leisure, care work, or voluntary, it becomes socially acceptable for it to be unpaid. It's a cultural narrative that developed alongside industrial capitalism. I mean, think about it. What other economic benefit would it serve to reframe fibercraft as a recreation? If I had just invested in an industrial knitting machine, it would be to my advantage to devalue the competition, right? And in that case, my competition would be the hand knitter. Additionally, shifting knitting from a mode of production to a hobby turns crafters from producers to consumers, to the benefit of pattern designers, yarn and tool companies, and all the platforms that host craft culture. Because you best believe that if pattern testing was reframed as an integral part of the industry, like say computer game testers, who by the way are also given professional titles known as quality assurance testers, we would also be paying knitwear testers or pattern testers. And this is where my thinking really shifted, because I realised I had been thinking about consumption in the wrong way. Like, craft is often framed as an alternative to consumer culture. It's about making, not buying. But in practice, that distinction doesn't really hold, because modern craft culture is organised in a way that makes consumption very much part of participation. To take part, you need materials, and to share your work, you need projects, and to stay visible, you need to keep making, and making usually requires buying. So consumption isn't just something that happens around craft, it's very much one of the ways it operates. This is where sociological ideas about consumption become useful. Pierre Bourdieu argued that consumption is often about identity and belonging, not just utility. And you can really see that in craft spaces. Materials don't just function as materials, they signal taste, your experience, your aesthetic, your community. So when people buy yarn, they're not just buying something to use, they're positioning themselves within a culture. And that's what makes the whole question of overconsumption that more complicated, because it's not a question of having too much, it's about participation and the way it's structured. So I asked you all to count your yarn in a previous video and in my community tab, just to get an idea. So I want to say a big thank you to the 243 respondents who participated. I know that that number was actually higher because some people responded by weight, or they answered the survey after the deadline, so sorry they weren't included in the count. But here are the results of all the people who responded as requested. In percentages, 11% of 243 respondents had fewer than 10 skeins. 40% had between 10 and 50 skeins, 25% had between 50 and 100 skeins, and another 25% had over 100 skeins, which means that most people aren't just making, they are accumulating. And seeing those numbers together made something very abstract feel very material, because suddenly participation had weight, volume, and scale. Before I even counted my stash, I knew I didn't really need it all, so I decided to donate some to a local primary school.
Hello, this is Jane. primary school. I'm just ringing regarding your email offering some fuzzy yarn to the school for our arts and crafts. I've spoken to our deputy head and she said, yes, please, we would love to have it. If you want to give me a call on...
And I urge anyone with yarn they know in their hearts that they won't use to find somewhere to donate it, because although craft exists inside systems of accumulation, it still also holds the possibility of redistribution. And then, of course, that led me thinking about the role of platforms in all of this, because craft culture today is shaped by systems and industry. Platforms don't just show us craft, they structure and carefully curate our attention. They determine what gets seen, what gets repeated, and what becomes desirable. And over time, that doesn't just affect visibility, it affects our practice. Because if certain things perform well, people start making those things. But most importantly to the system though, people buy the materials. I have been contemplating these ideas a lot as I try to balance the joy I get from making both fibre arts and content in general, while also being mindful of not only how much I consume, but also how I consume. If you want to explore some of the ideas behind this series further, I've included a reading list in the description. But I highly recommend that you start here. And I'd really love to hear your thoughts. What would crafts look like to you if it wasn't shaped by productivity, platforms, and profit?